As a music lover, I've always been interested in speakers and how to most accurately recreate the live music experience in my home. Speakers are transducers converting electrical energy to kinetic energy. And of course the opposite of microphones, which do the opposite, converting the kinetic energy of the sound into electrical energy. To do so accurately is perhaps the most difficult problem in hi-fi and sound recording. With microphones there's two types, there's dynamic microphones and condenser microphones. Dynamic microphones are the most common and they have a diaphragm attached to a coil of wires that moves within a magnetic field, creating the electrical current. These are the most durable and affordable, but they are not as sensitive as condenser microphones, and all hi-fi recordings really these days are produced with condenser microphones. They've got a very thin charged diaphragm which moves in response to the sound vibrations close to a backplate, changing the capacitance and resulting in the electrical signal. They are much more sensitive and accurate, but fragile. So the traditional box speaker with the paper cone, or these days paper has been replaced by all sorts of other materials like Kevlar and some tweeters, aluminium and even diamond in the B&W range, at the top of their range, as the diaphragm. But connected to that diaphragm, it's the same old coil inside, with a magnet around it to create the electrical, driven by the electrical signal from the source, and then you've got all the resonances associated with the box, and then of course you've got some materials which are great for high frequencies like those diamond tweeters I was telling you about, but the mid-range is better with a Kevlar diaphragm, so the frequency range then needs to be split up with a sort of complicated crossover network with capacitance and resistance, and that messes around with the timing of the audio signal, so there's potentially things aren't quite in phase. And then you've got the resonances of the actual box, which there are all sorts of different constructions to make a loudspeaker box to sort of absorb the rear sound with internal sort of acoustic damping, and those curved and laminated sort of wood boxes to try and make them dead, to stop, because they make sound themselves. So the alternative to the box speaker is electrostatics. And electrostatics are effectively the reverse of a condenser microphone, using a large, highly charged sheet of mylar, just 4 microns thick in this particular example that I'm going to tell you about, with virtually no inertia. And it's attracted and repelled by the audio signal, which is run through the stators, either side of the diaphragm. There's no complex electronic crossover network or capacitance or delays in the audio signal, and the whole of the diaphragm, potentially sort of half a meter squared on each speaker, and some of the very large sound lab electrostatics, a meter squared potentially of area, all driven intimately by the stators. Only large panel speakers can reproduce the transients realistically, and once you've heard electrostatic loudspeakers, there's just no substitute for them. Without any box resonances, they've got their own problems, of course. Box speakers, electrostatics, they fire sound out the back as well, and to avoid cancellation of the rear sound from the front, you potentially need to put them in the middle of the room, or well out from the walls, which They're big and cumbersome, very difficult to freight, often very expensive. Um, so there's all sorts of problems with them, but you once heard there's no going back really to a box. So electrostatic loudspeaker procurement is rather an expensive pastime. There's a number of suppliers, Martin Logan, the very famous Quad, since the 50s, probably some of the most innovative designs. And then the Sanders look a brilliant sort of design with sort of electrically curved network of resistors to one of the problems is the beaming of the high frequencies. High frequencies need to come from a very small point source, ideally, to propagate nicely throughout a room. And the Sanders design do that from very narrow strips, so it'd be good to have something similar to those. But very clever people. There's the Jazzman sort of made some electrostatic loudspeakers himself, which look fantastic. And clearly he's a very clever guy. And in the Sound Lab, King's Audio. I used to have a pair of Acoustats which sort of got me into electrostatics, but in the 80s or 90s I think it was. And they were magnificent, and that's obviously where I came from and got me into it. But they're all massively expensive, like humongously expensive, so just not affordable really for the ordinary guy. Until I came across ER Audio in Perth in Western Australia. And whilst they're not cheap, they by making a DIY kit, Rob McInlay, who's the proprietor of ER Audio, has made the freight sort of more accessible, but there is some work involved in putting it all together, and this video really is the story of how I managed to put mine together. You'll see behind me is the finished products. Yeah, I'll talk you through how I did it.
I wanted my speakers to look beautiful as well as sound beautiful, so I scoured Facebook Marketplace for some suitable hardwood to build the frame. One cold Saturday morning in September, I collected 2 Rimu wooden doors being discarded from an old farmhouse conversion in Otaki, just a few kilometres away.
A big part of the process is to build the frames. I was lucky enough to be able to score some Rimu doors, old Rimu doors, and Rimu's a native timber to New Zealand, which is no longer, well, it's protected, so you can't actually fell it. But as you can see, it's a beautiful grain. My woodworking skills are particularly average, so this is probably the most difficult aspect. Well, certainly it's the only aspect I've tackled so far, so it's certainly the most difficult so far, and probably the most challenging, I suspect, for the entire build. And not only have you got to build the frames, but also build the grills, and I have to build it with a sort of metal mesh, so that if there prevents any foreign objects from getting into contact with the stators, which can potentially carry very high voltages from the audio side. So yes, it's quite an intensive process, the building of the frames.
Very excited today. I bought a kit to make some electrostatic loudspeakers from a company called ER Audio in Perth, and I used to own a pair of Acoustats in the 90s, and I loved them, but kits came along and there was 5,000 volts bias voltage, which I had a handicapped boy, intellectually disabled, and felt it was probably inappropriate to have those in the living area, and they were extremely ugly, but absolutely beautiful sound. So they had to go, and I replaced them with a pair of B&W 804 Nautilus speakers, which have been marvellous, absolutely glorious, but hankered after the magic of electrostatics, which once heard. It's very hard to replace that mid-range gorgeous transients. Anyway, these aren't cheap, and it was a bit of a leap of faith really, because I haven't heard them, but there have been some pretty fantastic write-ups. These are ER Audio's ESL IVs, so there's 1.2 meters of high of electrostatic panel, and 450 wide, so and apparently produce reasonably good bass, which is one aspect which concerns me, because I'm getting reasonable, some output at 35 hertz from the B&Ws. I do also have an SBS subwoofer, but I expect it will be very difficult to integrate that with the ESLs. So today the package has arrived, the diaphragms and the transformers, and I've got the bill of materials here from Rob McInlay, who is the proprietor of ER Audio. I need to check them off, so it's now to unbox. So about to start the gluing of the spacers onto the stators, and reassuringly, Rob's produced a 77-page instructions with a very reassuring level of detail as to how it should be done. There are 8 stators, because the panels are stacked too high, and there's a front and a back stator, so 2 for each panel, and 2 high, that's 4 for each speaker. So the first step is to lightly abrade these fiberglass spacers. Interestingly, some electrostatic panels use just 3M tape, which is sort of flexible. This is sort of hard, so obviously much more, and quite a wide, I'm not sure, 2.5, maybe 3 mil, 2.5 mil air gap between the diaphragm, from each side. So there's one on each side of the mylar diaphragm. So obviously wider excursion, and that's probably why it produces a great deep bass. So first step, I shall abrade these, but I won't do it in here. I'll try and keep this a dust-free area. I'll do it in the garage to prevent getting dust on anything. So obviously the dust particles probably would be a bad mix with the electrostatic panel. So
once abraded, wiped down with methylated spirits, and then we can get into sticking them on. There's 2 vertical spacers along each side, and Rob's instructions say put the vertical up first and then butt up the horizontals against that vertical that's already there. And of course this down here is where the resistors all have to be soldered, and sort of ensures that the high frequencies go up the middle and progressively reduce frequency, so all of the panel is producing bass, and your better dispersion is achieved through just a very narrow section producing the high treble. So yeah, we need to apply this slow zap cyanacrylic sort of super glue, but I think it's slow setting super glue and a special sort of thick mix which sort of fills in holes. But to have all the fiberglass battens, which I'm sort of familiar with from sailing, but they're actually 3mm the spacers, so we'll put one along here, and then we'll butt these up, and the stators are all marked up with where they have to go. So, and then the remaining vertical there. So let's get into it. I've got the kit supplied with all the stuff, even the metal oxide paper for abrading the air gap spacers. Didn't come with any methylated spirits, so I had to but incredible the amount of stuff which comes with it. No attention, no stone is left unturned. Obviously Rob is very detail oriented, and obviously that's probably what's required when producing such amazing designs. Okay, let's see if we can break into this slow zap. So a small bead of this glue. Be very careful not to get anywhere near the grid. So these spacers on the back panels will have a copper tape along it, and the copper in contact with the conductive layer on the diaphragm is what passes the charge across the diaphragm. So just taking my time. Actually got longer than you think to work this. And so there's holes in the in these strips, but we have to drill those out afterwards from the other side. Obviously it'd be too difficult to try and match them up. While gluing these on, but I suppose this gives the stator good rigidity as well, rather than using the sort of the tape which they use in Martin Logan's, the 3M double-sided tape for the air gaps. Because this super glue is can easily stick in your fingers, it's best to wear gloves. Don't think the fumes are the best either. I think Rob's instructions say to wear a mask. I'm old enough to be broken already, so once these are stuck on, Rob's notes say it's very important not to bend the handle the stators with great care to ensure that the adhesive is not broken off, because on the front panel, the front stator, the mylar is attached diaphragm, and if on the front stator, you know, there is a weakness in the joint and it comes loose, it could potentially cause a little rattle and affect the audio. So he sort of comes up with the fix in case that does happen, but of course let's make sure it doesn't happen by handling these very carefully. And the next step is to drill out the holes of the horizontals, and apparently the hole is just fractionally over 4mm, and a 4mm diameter drill is the way to go. Now I have been warned that we really do not want to break the bond of the glue that we put in there, and I've had it curing for 24 hours. So we need to make sure that we're holding it down hard on the wood. I'm doing it outside as well because I'm keen to avoid getting any dust inside, and I'll be vacuuming up all this stuff before it contaminates my speaker. So that was the first part of the assembly, really, with the gluing of the spacers to the stators. In the second video I'll show you the actual soldering of all the components, the surface mount resistors to the stator, and then the soldering of the components to the printed circuit board for the power supply units, the tensioning of the diaphragm, and the gluing of the diaphragm material mylar to the stator, and then the final assembly into the speaker. So thanks very much for watching.